So I'd just like to say welcome everyone to the third CEMS seminar of the year. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on the beautiful lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as any First Nations people who are joining us today. So I'm Ros Smith, I'm the Director of the Centre for Early Modern Studies here at ANU and the founder of the International Consortium of Centres for Early Modern Studies, which joins our centre to Oxford, London, Paris and Ireland. And this event is a joint CEMS and iCEMS venture. And I'd like to extend a very special welcome to all of the iCEMS people who are joining us online on the other side of the world. So it's early morning there for you and late and early evening for us. And that's why we're having it at 6 p.m. so that we can reach the people, you know, in the UK and in Ireland and in Paris. And I want to thank you for coming along to Michelle's talk today. For everyone who's joining us online, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll read them out. Assisted with thanks by Dr. Christina Clark, who's helped with all the organisation of today's event. Anyone asking for questions from the floor? I was going to say wait for the microphone, but I don't think we'll need to here. So our presenter this evening is at ANU this month as a Research School of the Humanities and Arts Fellow. And I'd like to thank the RSHA and its director, Kate Mitchell, for their generous support of her visit. We're very fortunate to hear the scholarship of my very dear friend, colleague and collaborator, Michelle O'Callaghan, with whom I shared a supervisor and with whom I hung out on the stairs of the Bodleian Library, and whose work that I've admired for over 30 years. Michelle is Professor of Early Modern Literature at the University of Reading. She has published extensively on early modern literature and culture, from the Inns of Court to tavern societies to women's engagement in literary cultures. Her major books are many: The Shepherd's Nation, Jacobean Spencerians and Early Stuart Political Culture, Oxford University Press 2000, The English Wits, Literature and Sociability in Early Modern England, Cambridge University Press 2007, Thomas Middleton, Renaissance Dramatist, Edinburgh University Press 2009, and the brilliant Crafting Poetry Anthologies in Renaissance England, Early Modern Cultures of Recreation, Cambridge University Press 2020. She's also been the lead contributor to 2 digital projects, Verse Miscellanies Online and the Early Modern Women's Complaint Poetry Index. And she's currently co-writing a monograph with me and Professor Sarah Ross, Early Modern Women and the Poetry of Complaint, that should be, with any luck, published with OUP next year. So her paper today builds on her field-defining work, which extends the materiality of books as artefacts to their embodiments, their crafted, performative, recreational and expressive capacities. It's entitled Making Poetry Collections by Hand and Creative Leisure. Productive leisure.
It varies, I think. So firstly, I'd like to thank RSHA and CEMS at ANU, who have funded my time here through the fellowship scheme. And I really appreciate how generous and collegial everyone has been. And it's been a privilege to speak with the other visiting fellows and with PhDs and staff from the School of Literature, Language and Linguistics. This paper today, as Ros has suggested, develops my study of making poetry anthologies in crafting poetry anthologies in Renaissance England. The term making brings together the work with the hands and the conceptual processes involved in compiling verse collections. Studies by Geoffrey Todd Knight, Megan Heffernan, and myself have been driven by an understanding of how making verse collections was an embodied poetic practice. Setting poems alongside each other within a compilation in print and in manuscript results in a material intertextuality, in Knight's words, in which meaning is generated relationally and dynamically through the physical and discursive proximity of the gathered verse. And there is a craft to this process. Making relies on manual work, technical skills, and a culture that endows these practices with meaning, purpose, and value. I have explored this phenomenon in printed poetry collections, and today I'm moving from the printing house to thinking about the craft of manuscript production. So, what can a focus on the work of the hand bring to the study of making verse collections in early modern scribal cultures? Compiling poetry collections by hand is work like in that it depends on manual labor that required technical skills, was time-consuming, sometimes intensive. In the case of those manuscripts compiled by the user, it was also work that was undertaken by choice during leisure time and at some level was satisfying. So I'm interested in how the category of productive leisure, which turns attention to the pleasurable work of the hand, can help us understand the kinds of making practiced in scribal cultures in early modern England and beyond. The examples I will discuss were produced by scribes working outside commercial scriptoria, for whom penmanship was both work and recreation. In the second half of this paper, my examples will come from those below the gentry, who also provide evidence for literary cultures beyond early modern London and the universities. So how am I defining productive leisure? And I should say that I'm influenced by Rachel Main's study, Hedonizing Technologies, Paths to Pleasure in Hobbies and Leisure. I should acknowledge that it's not without problems, especially around the history and politics of work, but it's helpful it's been helpful for thinking about the uses of technology. In my case, hand copying for individual and communal pleasure. When she's looking at the earlier period, she concentrates on needlework. So Mains uses the term productive leisure to define hobbies and to describe activities that are not economically necessary or required, but voluntary and chosen. So we need to remind ourselves that the term hobby does not come into use until the early 19th century. And in some cases, this is key. However, rather than a category mistake, thinking about this term in relation to the earlier period can be generative and focus attention on historical differences as well as similarities. The concept of productive leisure, of course, doesn't float free of historical socioeconomic forces. Since time and space outside of work were required for leisure, it can also be a means for performing social and cultural capital, and it is, of course, mediated by gender and race as well as class. So how can we understand hand copying as work? Marcy North's 2015 essay, Household Scribes and the Production of Literary Manuscripts in Early Modern England, turned our attention to the role of literate servants in literary manuscript production as scribes, readers, and sometimes even collectors of verse, and relatedly, the status of hand copying as manual work. Assessing the involvement of servants in household manuscript production, as she notes, is fraught with difficulties because of the very anonymity of the vast majority of those involved in scribal production. But rather than known individuals, in many ways, it's the stylistic appearance of professional hands in manuscripts that can reveal the work of literate servants. Since there is little evidence pre-restoration that literary manuscripts were produced commercially in scriptoria, North argues, that it is more likely that these professional hands were those of literate servants employed in elite households and trained in hand copying. She points to those manuscript verse collections copied in a mix of hands, some skilled and others unskilled, which suggests the ad hoc employment of a literate servant trained in penmanship, working close at hand in the household. The literate servant is a professional copyist, but not a commercial one, since this type of scribal work was not necessarily their sole occupation within the household. That said, the scribal work of this figure does usefully blur any clear-cut division between amateur and commercial manuscript production, allowing us to think across these categories. And this work also productively blurs the line between work and leisure. The work literate servants performed when producing verse collections may have served the interests of their employer rather than their own. That said, this work also enabled these scribes to share the leisure activities of their employer and offered the possibility of participating in a literary community, although crucially unequally. So, oh no, how do I move it on? Ah, which one?
It should from now on there.
Ah, brilliant. Solved, thank you. So the examples that I will now turn to, I should say, are not literate servants working within a household, supplying skills and labor for their employers' hobbies, but scribes who, I will argue, were engaged in their own activities of productive leisure, what we might want to call hobbies, by making verse collections. So how might the making of literary manuscripts function as productive leisure? Integral to this type of leisure activity is the fact that it involves labor, hand copying that's sometimes inconvenient, often intensive, and is work-like in that it requires time, labor, and skill. At the same time, this is work that is chosen rather than economically necessary and is pleasurable in part because it gives technological satisfaction gained through the processes of making. One way that this pleasure is manifested, I will suggest, is through work that is surplus to requirement, the something else beyond that which is functionally necessary. Now, I should say here also that defining what is necessary is, of course, really tricky. But it's this fuzziness and trickiness that's also productive in terms of the kinds of questions that it raises. So my first example is Robert Roberts' manuscript book, which is held in the Bodleian. The high level of skill involved in making this verse collection is very evident in the manuscript. It's a vellum-bound quired folio manuscript book that was probably bought ready-made by Roberts. And his is a professional hand with technical skills very evident in his practices of hand copying. Roberts was employed in a secretariat, so he does fit North's category of the literate servant. And he may well have been involved in literary manuscript production in the households in which he was employed. However, evidence suggests that this manuscript book was not produced for an employer, but was for personal and communal use. Roberts began with a plan to produce two distinct sections and so divided the paper book by casting off blank pages. The first section is reserved for English Latin verse, and on screen is part of a section that includes a substantial selection of Latin verse addressed to his school friends that is gathered near the start of the collection. And here I just ask you to note the red ink, which you might not be able to see, but it is there. It's the lighter ink. Now, the second section consists of Welsh language poems and begins with the heading Welsh verses in the left margin, as you can see there. Roberts was Welsh, and verse is exchanged with friends and family. His manuscript book fashions a local Welsh identity in relation to his other identities that are fashioned in other sections of the book and bring him into dialogue with other communities. What we do know about Roberts indicates that he received the type of humanist education, which, as North has shown, taught skills in hand copying alongside compilation. He entered Shrewsbury School in 1581 below the rank of a gentleman, and his Shrewsbury School friends are the ones addressed in the collection. It's likely he was the Robert Roberts, who matriculated from Jesus College, Cambridge in 1588 as a poor scholar. And at grammar school and university, Roberts would have received the technical training in scribal skills and document organization that made him employable as a secretary. So while he may not have been a professional scribe in a commercial sense, employed within a scriptorium, hand copying was part of his profession as a secretary and a technical skill that was valued by others. By 1606, Roberts was employed in the secretariat of Ludovic Stuart, 2nd Duke of Lennox, a key figure at James's court. He was both Privy Councillor and First Gentleman of James's bedchamber. Membership of Lennox's secretariat gave Roberts privileged access to scribal communities at court and in London, and you can see these in his manuscript verse collection. We know through correspondence in Roberts' hands, for example, that he was in contact with the secretariat of Robert Cecil, 1st Earl of Salisbury, and he seems to have capitalized on these exclusive networks for his own literary project, borrowing verses circulating in these channels that he may well have been employed to copy for another purpose. Robert copies into his book two extremely rare court poems, one by Cecil and the other attributed to Richard Burke, Earl of Clarencade. So working within a court secretariat gave Roberts extraordinary access to poems that otherwise did not enter wider circulation via scribal networks. So time, labor, and technical skills went into the making of his verse collection. The work on show on the screen suggests an appreciation of the skills of hand copying, in that the labor involved in this work arguably goes beyond that which is strictly necessary for the book to be functional in verse transmission. Roberts didn't buy the book ruled, since there are the ruled lines that you can see there run across the gutter, leaving it unmarked. Instead, he carefully ruled the pages throughout, apart from the preliminary and end blank leaves, before poems and other material were copied into the book. Ruling is obviously functional in that it helps to organize the copying of the verse, but what is distinctive is the level of care, the way that, as you can see on the screen, leaves have been folded in half vertically, and in pencil, 2 lines have been ruled vertically and 5 horizontally, and then coloured red ink is used to distinguish between the different sections. Such attention to detail carries meaning. It isn't neutral and can be interpreted as indicative of the satisfaction to be gained from utilising one's skills and in the use of the tools of his craft, for example, different inks. And I think it's helpful to think of this work in terms of what Maynes has described as the artisanal pleasures expressed through hobbies, productive leisure, as the control and mastery, the beauty of the individuality of the product, and the quality of the immersion in voluntary chosen work that this suggests. So my next example illustrates how penmanship was a skill cultivated not only by those looking for employment in a secretariat. If, as Marcy North argues, the work of scribes was considered a menial labour by some, unworthy of those of high status, there are others of this social stratus who did work to master this manual skill. So John Ramsay's encyclopedic commonplace book testifies to this gentleman's personal and economic investment in the arts of hand copying. Unlike Roberts, who could only claim gentry status through education, Ramsay came from the landed gentry. Ramsay entered Peterhouse, Cambridge in 1601. He then left to go to court at James's accession, entering the household of his kinsman, Sir John Ramsay, as a gentleman of James's bedchamber, so as a courtier, not as a secretary. After his father's death in 1605, Ramsay retired from court to his country estate, but he quickly realised that he needed an understanding, a smattering of the law. So he then returned to London, entering the Middle Temple in 1606, and it's in London that he gained these arts of penmanship. So he was clearly interested in the arts of calligraphy and may have been taught penmanship by Peter Bales, a respected writing master who ran a school in London near the Old Bailey. Ramsay copied into his book Edward Beacon's The Art of Brachygraphy. So that's an account of shorthand. So he's also using other manuals as an adjunct to teaching. And he also makes copies of books of poetry in his own carefully manufactured paper books. And on the screen, you can see his copying of Francis Savy's Fisherman's Tale. And he also does its continuation, Flora's Fortune, which were both published by Richard Jones in 1595. Edward Doughty suggests that it's likely these were copied as exercises in penmanship, but the amount of time, effort, technical skill, creativity, and inventiveness devoted to this task suggests something more than simply an exercise, perhaps a hobby, an example of productive leisure that is work-like and points to the satisfaction to be gained from the mastery of technical manual skills and the pleasure that can also be gained from immersion in such voluntary chosen work. So Ramsay, as we can see, is interested in design and transposes decorative typographical elements of the printed text into his own hand-drawn ornaments display his mastery of the calligraphic arts. So you can see how he modifies inventively the printer's ornaments that frame that first page of the Fisherman's Tale. Now, the design work on the second part, this is Flora's Fortune, is even more elaborative, highly worked and creative. Decorative initials begin each line, lines end with decorative curlicues, pages are cut so that they're alphabetized, A to V, and he does his own version. He hand copies the woodcuts. Not very well, it should be said, but at least he tries. But what we're seeing here is not simply a simulacra of the printed book. Instead, what it's doing is displaying skills in calligraphy. And there is a real delight in the use of this handicraft technology for this particular purpose. Hand copying whole books that are already printed, which in part gives the work and the objects its meaning and value. And I think it's also distinctive. I'm not sure that the alphabet down the side forms any function apart from using particular sets of skills and experimenting with certain types of skills. Now, there is a rather sad coda to Ramsay's story, which gives a sense of what is personally involved in this activity, and that's when Ramsay loses his hand. So in that square box, it says, in 1628, in single combat, after I'd given my enemy his life by an unhappy blow, I lost the use of my right hand, which makes me write now so ill with the left. And you also see across those pages a further degeneration of his left hand through his illness in later life when he gets palsy. So the arts of calligraphy and compilation involved in making verse miscellanies was not confined to those employed in secretariats or to the gentry. So my next example, Leonard Wheatcroft from Ashover in Derbyshire, had many occupations, as Sue Wiseman and others have shown. He was a tailor, a brewer, a carpenter, and significantly for me, he was a parish clerk, which meant that hand copying was also part of his work, his paid employment. The verse miscellany he compiled is carefully crafted and presented as a book of love made for his courtship of his wife, while it's also advertised and mimics the titling of other printed miscellanies in this period. And you can see it says, "Come, you gallants, look and buy, here is mirth and melody." But this was not paid work, but rather intended for personal and communal pleasure, although this work did produce social capital in that it contributed to his standing and future employment in the community. Evidence for his skillfulness can be seen in his version of the very popular trick poem, Her Face, Her Tongue, Her Wit, which was first published in Britain's Barra in 1591 and then reprinted in the 1641 edition of Wit's Recreation. And this is where he probably gets it from. Now, he modifies this poem, changing the pronoun her to your to personalize the verse. And he also explains the trick in a verse below, 6 ways you may read it. The trick relies on the visual layout of the poem in columns. Wheatcroft takes the material design of the poem a step further by adding decorative elements. It's often not printed in this way. It's often printed very plainly. So what he adds are curlicues and foliage. His book showcases the manual skills of hand copying in ways that expressed his own value as an artisan and the value of this leisure activity. It's work-like rather than paid work, and there's also a play factor that comes from the technical skillfulness and working with the tools of his craft, pen, ink, and paper. So my last example, which is in the British Library, is Harley 6910. And it's predominantly copied in one very skilled hand, indicating that this manuscript is the work of a professional scribe for whom hand copying was essential to their employment. Available evidence also suggests that the scribe was a clerk and that the manuscript was compiled in large part for the owner's enjoyment. The work that has gone into the compilation of this manuscript showcases the skills of the scribe, possibly with a view to capital formation, as was possibly the case with Roberts and also Wheatcroft, advertising skills for future employment. But the labour that went into the production of this manuscript is also evidence for the scribe's own personal satisfaction in the exercise of his skill. So we could think of it as a hobby, as I'll suggest, shared with others. So why Harley does not appear to be the work of a professional scribe employed to produce a verse collection for a client, for a patron, is because it has imperfections that could have very easily been rectified. So you can see there on the screen that there is this opening false start. He starts copying the section from Prosopopoeia, Spencer's Prosopopoeia or Mother Hubbard's Tale. And then he redoes it. He's obviously not satisfied with what he's produced, and he starts again. And you can see it was the month of May. It is more engrossed than the earlier version. So you could see him trying out different techniques. So instead, Harley seems to be another example of user publication by a professional scribe. And I want to argue that in the case of Harley, the time, effort, and technical skill devoted to making this verse collection exceeds the functional, by which I mean what is necessary for recording poetry for current and future uses. And I'm very aware that this is open to debate, and perhaps we can think about this as more of a spectrum rather than something that is very clear-cut. So why it is more than functional? Firstly, there is the care and attention, the mastery of penmanship, and the beauty of the book, which conveys a sense of the enthusiasm, enjoyment, and a phrase that I have repeated before, the sense of immersion in this voluntary chosen work. Every page, apart from the end papers, has carefully ruled margins on all sides, which organize the copying. The one exception is telling, these are the exception are a set of poems that are copied by different hands at the very end after the main scribe finishes. So these are poems that come after the work of this scribe. So although this scribe doesn't regularly provide titles or attributions, poems conclude with a finis or a decorative flourish. Catchwords are used consistently when extracts run over for more than one page, and spaces are left for omitted words and lines, presumably for filling in later. So secondly, why there is something beyond the functional is that a very high proportion of the poetry copied into the manuscript comes from previously printed books rather than from manuscript sources. For much of the collection, the scribe is excerpting from long poems and often in very long sections. There are also some shorter excerpts, but what is surprising are the very long excerpts. The fact that poetry is taken from printed works is suggestive, as I've said, of the surplus value characteristic of productive leisure. Long extracts are copied over many pages, foregrounding the labor that went into the task, which, you know, it takes a hell of a lot of time. So there has to be some kind of enjoyment involved in the process. Arguably, it's not necessary work since these poems were readily available in print. The first 70 or so leaves are made up of poems excerpted from Spencer's 1591 collection, his complaints, beginning with almost 40 pages of Mother Hubbard's tale. It sets in place a taste for political and religious complaints that is notable elsewhere in the collection. After Spencer, 2 hymns from George Chapman's Shadow of the Night are followed by a shorter extract from William Warner's Albion's England. And then you get a very sententious poem from Henry Peacham's The Garden of Eloquence. And then over the next 20 or so pages, you get extracts from Mirror for Magistrates, interspersed with a couple of extracts from Albion's England, and you get a smidgen of the Garden of Eloquence. Then the scribe copies extracts from Daniel's Civil Wars and Southwell's St. Peter's Complaint, which are then added to this mix of Mirror for Magistrates and Albion's England. So what do we know about the scribe? Catherine Gottschalk, in her edition of this manuscript for her 1972 Chicago PhD dissertation, provisionally identified Francis Raworth because there is a Latin epitaph copied towards the end of the manuscript for Raworth, who died in 1524, and for his wife Margaret, who died in 1638, and we have their will, so it confirms the dates of their death. But it also suggests that this epitaph was copied after 1638. So Raworth is referred to as scriba publicus within his epitaph, which could be translated as clerk or official secretary of state. And so this is most likely the Francis Raworth, who was the town clerk of Dover in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, which coincides with the period when the bulk of the manuscript was copied. An aspect of Raworth's work, a major aspect, was that of a scribe, copying and compiling civic documents. And Francis appears to be the name, unfortunately, given to the eldest sons in the family. So there's a whole series of Rawworth's name Francis in local civic government. And they're also lawyers in the period. And it should also be said that you can see the family rising socially over the course of the 17th century. And there is also some surviving manuscript evidence which might help identify the scribe. And I'm very grateful to Mark Ballard, the archivist at Kent Archives, for pointing me towards this material. So on the screen there, you have Egerton 2106, which is a register of the final concords and indentures of agreement enrolled by the Dover town clerks between 1576 and 1613. Now, it's water damage and it's very faded in part, which sort of gives you a sense of the tenuousness of this kind of manuscript evidence. So documents are copied to which Francis Rawworth's name is subscribed, although it's very difficult to determine whether he is the scribe who copied the document, because as you can see on this slide, the hand of the document to which his name is subscribed, it varies. This is not the same hand. The middle one is much more of an upright hand. So this indicates that more than one clerk was involved. And relatedly and interestingly, his name is subscribed alongside that of others who are often acting as witnesses, such as Thomas Watson. So while I am yet to identify a particular individual hand, and I do need to do a lot more work on scribal practices of town clerk, I would want to argue that it is possible to identify a similar style that affiliates these manuscripts in the sense of the general appearance of writing or sets of writing, the techniques of penmanship that are not specific to individual writers, but to a profession. This style, which uses engrossing, italics, and a fairly round secretary script, is a clerk style, I would want to suggest. And what I've done on the screen is I've placed side by side Egerton and Harley, so you can see the general appearance. There is some similarity of hands, which requires much more investigation, and that is suggested by the A's. So what I've done on the screen is you've got, first you've got Harley, then you've got Egerton, then you've got Egerton, and then you've got Harley. And what I would want to draw your attention to is the similarity of the A's and D's, which are slanted to the left, and you get this real pressure on the downward stroke and the upward stroke, so that it's almost but not quite clubbed. Right. I now want to, now that I've just introduced the individual hand, I want to talk about why a focus on a shared style rather than an individual hand might be useful, because it allows us to think about how Harley 6910 might be situated within a community of clerks, Dover town clerks, who took pride in their calligraphic skills, not only in their working hours, but also at times of leisure. Now, I'm not saying that it's not one hand, but rather that a focus on style allows us to shift our perspective from the individual to the communal. And clerks are really interesting. So how might this 16th, 17th century involvement of clerks in literary manuscript production be related to the centrality of clerks such as Thomas Hoccleve in late medieval vernacular literary manuscript production? And in terms of question of work and leisure, we can also say that there's a difference between the clerk's hands in Egerton and in Harley, in that the former is copying for efficiency and speed, while the latter, as we have seen, is taking more time and investing considerable care, which is evident in the comparative regularity, evenness, and the use of white space, all of which suggests the satisfaction and pleasure gained from the exercise of these technical skills. So, if the level of craft evident in Harley demonstrates a type of productive leisure, how might what the contents of what is copied determine how leisure is conceptualized? This is a different type of consideration of style. Although this verse collection was compiled from the late 1590s, it has the orientation of earlier 1560s to 1580s collections like Paradise of Dainty Devices, which are dominated by the type of moralizing poetry that Mary Crane and others have identified with the middling sort. Verse collections compiled from the 1590s tend to be dominated by lyric poetry. So we could argue that Harley emerges out of a culture in which participation in poetic production as a leisure activity has moved down the social scale, engaging the middling sort in literary endeavors, including making verse collections. And here the fact that the majority of the poetry in Harley comes from printed sources available outside of the more elite scribal channels of the university and Inns of Court also might be telling in terms of the social status of its compilers. The collection of moralizing verse also fashions the technologies of pleasure involved in Harley's production into the forms of productive virtue alongside leisure. So we've got productive virtue. I'll be quick. Harley, however, is not as uniform as this implies, which is itself telling. There's a very distinct shift in the type of verse copied into Harley about 3/4 of the way through, when the poetry collected is very much in vogue in the 1590s and is dominated by the so-called courtier poets, Sidney, Dyer, Essex, Raleigh, as well as those who passed as courtly, like Breton, and you could even add Mundy, Anthony Mundy, whose songs were printed in England's Helicon in 1600. Now, more of this verse was circulating in manuscript rather than printed. And here you can see the popular manuscript lyric in the voice of Anne Vavasor that Ros has written about. The current state of Harley does obscure this stylistic shift because the manuscript was rebound and foliated soon after it came to the British Library in the 19th century, when pages were also cropped, which may have removed the original foliation, And also at this stage, quires were moved in the rebinding and leaves were lost. It alerts us to the complex histories of compilation that extended well beyond the initial moment of production and across a range of agents. Now, despite the uniformity of the hand, it's highly unlikely that Harley was a completely pre-planned collection, although some sections within it are obviously planned. And it was certainly copied over time. And towards the very end of the manuscript, as I've said, other hands intervene. The courtly lyrics verse that is copied in the hand of the main scribe, who was previously exerting verse from printed volumes like Mirror for Magistrate. That is said, you still do get this mixing on the one page. So here you get lyrics from Thomas Welks's Book of Madrigals and by Nash and Campion that are taken from the 1591 edition of Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, that are then copied alongside the history of Cardinal Wolsey and Shaw's wife from Mirror for Magistrates. And some of the lyrics by Sidney, Campion, Breton, Thomas Watson Dye, the Earl of Oxford, and the anonymous lyrics were available in print in editions of Sidney's Astrophil and Stella and the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, in poetry anthologies, as I've suggested, and also in collection of songs, airs. So that's where a lot of the Campion lyrics are circulating. However, there are a number that were only circulating in manuscript and others that are unique to this manuscript. And it may be the case that some of the lyrics that do have a life in print were also possibly sourced from manuscript. So whereas print is comparatively open in terms of transmission, access to poems circulating in manuscript tends to be more restricted. The scribe at this point had access to verse circulating in manuscript channels and incorporates these into his practices of copying and into the verse collection. So what happens to these pleasures of productive virtue that I have suggested in part generated the copying of earlier sections? Are there other kinds of pleasure that are being generated? The dominance of airs and other songs copied into this section introduces a mode of pleasure associated with private recreation. And some caution does need to be used here because by the late 1590s, many of these airs were printed in songbooks. But what I want to draw attention to here is the varied and sometimes overlapping cultures of leisure that are performed in Harley and how they might be shaped by the changing socio-economic situation of the compiler. And I'll close by saying that one view of the phenomenon I have been describing in the latter half of this paper is that participation in literary scribal cultures by those groups below the gentry was a means of accessing and performing social and cultural capital by aping the elite. Hence, the compilation of literary manuscripts is a bid for gentility, for the prestige associated with poetic amateurism. So this, as I've been suggesting, is an aspect of productive leisure. However, such a reading does not fully account for the ways in which hand copying was work, which rather than only looking socially upwards, also allows us to look across and down to other cognate areas of work in which the technical skills of hand copying were practiced at times of leisure. And thinking about productive leisure as a category in scribal literary production, so defined because it is work-like, draws attention to the technological skills and satisfaction that might allow us to define and distinguish between different practices and cultures of manuscript production. And this is what I've been trying to convey through comparing and distinguishing the various examples that I've discussed. Now, it obviously does not necessarily describe all manuscript production, but I think it's a tool to think with that allows us to consider the pleasurable, skillful, creative, and laborious work of the hand. So, thank you.